Hello again, I'm Wallaber, and I am the original creator of JellyCar, and I'm back after 10 plus years making a sequel called JellyCar Worlds. This is Devlog number 5, and the game is fairly far along in production at this point, which means I'm mostly focused on filling up the game with content. In other words, levels. That makes this month a great time to talk about the topic of level design. So JellyCar is an example of a level-based game with a somewhat linear structure. Players play through small levels individually, complete them, and then gain access to more levels. This is a structure you'll often see in 2D platformers, classic games such as Mario and Sonic, or more modern games such as Super Meat Boy and Celeste. It's also a great structure for puzzle games, so things like Snake Bird, or Baba Is You, or even Steven's Sausage Roll would be examples. This game structure does have its pros and cons. Some of the pros would be, you have tons of control over the player experience. Because you're making individual levels, you know exactly what's going to happen in that one level, and because you're controlling the sequencing of the game, you know when and where players will experience the content of your game. This works really great for games that have a lot of different mechanics as well, because you as the designer can control when and how the players are introduced to each mechanic. And from a player point of view, these games are very clear and have a great sense of progression because you complete individual units of content, which is very satisfying. Of course, you have to be careful with a structure like this because it's very easy, for example, for a player to get stuck. If you have a linear structure and one level is too difficult or confusing for players, that's it. Of course, the flip side of this is players getting bored. Because everything's fairly linear, if players aren't finding the content interesting, there's nowhere else for them to go to find something interesting to them, and so they'll stop playing. From a production point of view, of course, it's a little scary to make these carefully crafted individual levels that players just complete and move on. So we'll deal with some of these pros and cons as I talk about my approach to designing levels for this type of game, which I call mechanic-centric level design. So when you're designing a level-based game, as a designer, your big question is, how am I going to make all these levels? And if you imagine that your game needs, let's say, 50 levels, then suddenly you have 50 blank sheets of paper staring you down as a designer. Some designers might just approach this by just making random levels and keeping the ones they like. I like to give myself a little bit of structure so that that problem of 50 blank sheets of paper becomes a little more manageable. And a common thing that not only I do, but most games of this type do, is they break the content up into large segments. So maybe you take those 50 levels and you break them up into 5 segments of 10 levels each. What I like to do is take some major mechanic from the game and let that be the inspiration for how you divide up the content. Then, when you're working on an individual section, now instead of 50 levels, you're working on the 10 levels from this one section, for example, you also have a game mechanic that should provide some inspiration for what should be in those levels. Then, when you're focusing on an individual level, you take your overarching game mechanic that's part of this section, and then you take your other game mechanics and you mix and match them in interesting and unique ways for each individual level. This takes the problem from, I need to make 50 levels, to I need to make 10 levels about mechanic A, and each one of those levels can be A plus mechanic X, A plus mechanic Y, A plus mechanic Z. Of course, it can feel a little robotic to follow that perfectly rigidly, so it's a good idea to make some weird levels or some pace breaker levels and sprinkle them in as well. Okay, let me talk about this in JellyCar terms. So my high-level mechanic is power-ups. The car has these power-ups that you can collect that give it a new ability. And so I decided I'd break my game up into worlds, and each world would have some kind of focus around one power-up or another. So for example, World 2 is the Grow and Shrink power-up, World 3 is the Balloon power-up, etc. So when I'm designing a single level, I can say, okay, I'm designing a level in World 4. World 4 is focused around the Sticky Tires power-up. So what's a combination of Sticky Tires and some other mechanic in my game that I haven't focused on yet? And because I know you're in World 4, which is the Sticky Tires world, I know you've already been to World 3, which is the Balloon world. So then I can ask myself, for a specific level, what can you do if you combine Sticky Tires and balloons? That led me to a concept for a level where you could stick onto an object that was blocking you, and then use the balloon to lift that object up out of the way to gain access and progress through the level. Then what I'll do is I'll get right in and try making different scenarios in the level editor and test out what works and what doesn't work. This particular combination led to a few different ideas that all revolved around picking up an object and carrying it somewhere else. And so I ended up doing a common thing I do, which is made a level with essentially 3 sections in it that all are 3 different variations on this combination of mechanics. It doesn't always work that way, so in a later level, for example, I combined Sticky Tires and conveyor belts, which led me to one somewhat complex puzzle, which I decided then to focus the entire level around that puzzle. And so rather than being 3 rooms with variations on Sticky Tires and conveyors, this level is basically one key puzzle with an intro and an outro. Now in the case of JellyCar, I mentioned that the worlds are generally themed around power-ups, but every now and then I'll have an idea for a level that doesn't involve power-ups in particular. For example, I had this concept for a level where the goal itself is a dynamic object that can move and bounce, and the player is constantly hitting triggers that cause the goal to be thrown across the level and they have to keep chasing after it. This turned out to be a really fun level design, but it's not particularly focused around a power-up of the car. And I love these types of levels because, for example, when I'm working on the balloon world, I don't really want the entire thing to be just 8 levels, balloon after balloon after balloon after balloon. And so I like to take these sort of pace breaker levels and pepper them in here and there to give the player a break and make sure the game continues to feel fresh and surprising. Okay, let's go back and look at JellyCar Worlds level design through these lens of pros and cons I mentioned for level-based games. Number one, I mentioned players can get stuck. I address this problem in 2 ways. Number one, I try not to focus on difficulty. Although many players will have the expectation that games just get harder and harder and harder the farther you go into them, I prefer to try and give the player the expectation that they're going to encounter more and more variety as they progress through the game. So basically that means I don't focus on making the levels harder. I use my mechanical structure to make sure that what players are experiencing as they progress through is something new. Now what about players getting bored? Again, I think this structure where I have a high-level mechanical theme for each world, and then each level is unique in that it has some kind of interesting combination of that mechanic and other mechanics in the game, means that every level that exists in the game must be different than other levels that came before or after it. And if that's true, then players are getting variety, and it's less likely they're going to get bored. Now, if you're working on a game and you want there to be 50 levels, but you keep struggling trying to come up with unique ideas for each level, that's probably an indication that your game doesn't have enough systems or mechanics to combine to make 50 interesting, unique levels. And in that scenario, you've got 2 options. One is to add more variety to your game so that you can produce 50 unique levels, or to shorten your game to the right number of levels that are interesting and unique. So if you're making more of a story-based game, for example, where the real drive for players to progress through your game is the story, then this absolute need for every level to have unique mechanics is probably less important. And the final problem I mentioned is that this is an inefficient type of production. I make these thoughtful levels, I put a lot of time and effort into each one, and players play through them once and just move on. In the case of JellyCar, I've done my best to get the most amount of meaningful replayability out of the levels as I can. And that involves, number one, adding a secret exit. The physics-based design of JellyCar means that the levels are actually kind of fun to look at from an exploration point of view, and not just how do I get to the exit, but where else can I go? And so secret exits work great for that because it makes players look at the level as, where could I possibly hide a secret exit? Secret exits turn the levels from having 1 playthrough to having at least 2 playthroughs, so good work, I doubled it. But I've added a few other elements as well. I have collectibles you can find that should make it interesting to go back and try to complete the levels while collecting the collectibles. And I have a challenge system I'm working on so that when there's a level that I can think of an interesting challenge that would make it interesting to play it again, I can add a challenge for that level and get another round of replayability out of it. So to recap, my mechanic-centric level design approach involves taking a big system of your game, using it as the overall way to break up the content of your game into sections, and then in each section find interesting and unique combinations between that main mechanic and the other mechanics in your game. And if you do that well, with a little variety thrown in and pace breakers thrown in as well, you should come together with a structure that makes it straightforward for you, the designer, to think about what I should make for a specific level. And from a player point of view, hopefully this all comes together into a game that is continually surprising, interesting, and enjoyable. Okay, so that's my approach to level design in JellyCar Worlds. I'll be back in about a month or so with another update on the game. If you'd like to follow along more frequently, please check out my Twitter or TikTok, where I post more frequently short little tidbits and behind-the-scenes clips. Thanks again. See you next time.